Ladies, have you ever begrudged having to find a bag that perfectly matched your outfit? And gentlemen, have you ever been asked to carry someone's keys or ID? I bet you have, and that's because women frequently don't have pockets. And when we do, they're often not fully functional. Today, on Footnoting History, I'm going to think about where pockets come from and why ladies don't have them. Hi, I'm Sam, and I'd like to welcome you to Footnoting History. If you like the work we do, consider joining our Patreon or buying some merch from our store, which you can find along with additional materials relating to our podcast on our website, www.footnotinghistory.com. I usually don't do this, but for this episode, I'd like to start with a word or two about myself, or rather, about my kids. You see, when my son turned 4, he started collecting pocket treasures. And every day, I would find an abandoned stick that had transformed into a sword through the magic of imagination, or a few rocks, and at least 4 snack wrappers lovingly carried home and then forgotten in the laundry. But my daughter never had pocket treasures. And it's not because she was less curious or less inclined to collect. The reason my daughter never got to bring things home was that girls' clothing rarely has pockets. And so, because I had blindly decided to shop in the girls' department, my inquisitive younger child didn't have any place she could stash the various sundries that she encountered throughout her day. I noticed this lack of pockets and was annoyed by it, but it didn't occur to me until I was doing research for this podcast that through all of this, my daughter was being conditioned to expect less from her clothing. By the time she was 2 years old, she was starting to learn that she would need a bag to carry her things. And in the process, she would have to sacrifice a hand or brave the chafing of a crossbody bag. And if she dared to put her precious bag down, she would risk losing the thing she loved. Either she will grow into a pocket-having rebel like her mom, or she will continually have to expend her precious executive functioning skills, keeping track of her stuff while her brother can expect to carry everything safely close. I am, of course, by no means the first person to have the realization that the possession of pockets and the design of clothing is a feminist issue. My goal right now is to take a few moments of your day to explore the history of pockets and to figure out how ladies ended up having such poor pocket game. Inset pockets seem to have developed first in Europe toward the end of the Middle Ages. If you want to learn more about medieval fashion, I strongly recommend Kristen's episode on the topic. But for now, I suppose it suffices to know that in the Middle Ages, both men and women wore belts that held both tools and purses. Indeed, the purse was a mark of status, and it was often constructed from comparatively expensive and finely decorated materials. For medieval poets, the positioning of the purse was also sometimes highly eroticized. The earliest pockets were simply small bags. In fact, the word pocket comes from the Anglo-Norman poke, meaning bag, and the suffix et, meaning small. These bags could fall into the wrong hands. And so by the middle of the 12th century, there were some who decided to hold them on the inside of the loose, long-fitting robes or tunics that were worn by both sexes at the time. As tailored dresses became more popular, tailors sometimes included a slit in the seam between the front and the side panels at hip level to allow a bag to be positioned under the garment. Wearers could rest their hands in the openings and keep their pockets inside of them. We can see an example of these slits in a sculpture of Joan, the daughter of King Edward III, at Westminster Abbey, which you can find linked in the show notes. These pockets, however, were sewn into the main garments. Most likely, pockets were not permanently attached because they would have been comparatively fragile and would not have stood up well to the rough washing methods that were used at that time, which would have meant that a sewn-in pocket would need to be regularly repaired or replaced. So instead of sewing them in, they just kind of hold them. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, clothing became more and more gendered, and men started wearing padded garments called hose. And again, if you'd like more detail about this shift, I will refer you to Kristen's episode. There were many styles of breeches across Europe, but eventually they began to become fuller and puffier. To achieve this rounded effect, tailors stuffed breeches with hair, or with quilted lining, or with a cotton padding known as bombast. It's actually from this stuffing that we get the word bombastic, because men with particularly large breeches compensated by adopting a distinctive walk that came associated with militaristic and pugnacious attitudes. By the 1560s, these pants were so ridiculous that the English crown began issuing edicts intending to limit their, and here I quote, monstrous and outrageous greatness, end quote, by limiting the amount of filling that tailors could use. It appears that sewn-in pockets first appeared in these overstuffed pants. And in fact, there is even a record of a man who was chastised for breaking the sumptuary laws limiting the size of pants. He was, however, exonerated from any payment when he revealed the contents of his pockets and demonstrated thereby that his pants were not overstuffed. They were full of useful things, including, apparently, 4 spare shirts, a pair of sheets, 2 tablecloths, 10 napkins, a brush, a mirror, and, of course, a comb, along with various other sundries that were not listed. Descriptions like this one demonstrate that in the 16th century, pockets must have been both sturdier and larger than the ones we typically see today. Some were attached to the exterior of clothing and were closed with drawstrings, others were stitched into the side seams, much as pockets are today. So pretty much as soon as pockets were first sewn into clothing, they were most commonly an additional to male ensembles. Women could have pockets attached to their skirts. In fact, Queen Elizabeth I's wardrobe accounts indicate that a few of her casual gowns had pockets. But it remained much more common for women to wear purses suspended from belts. To be fair, sometimes men had both, so they'd have the pocket and a purse on a belt. It is perhaps worth noting that at first, the reason that men were more likely to have pockets than women is not just the patriarchy, though the fact that men wore the breeches was already recognized as a symbol of their authority within the family unit. Instead, it appears to have been a fashion decision. Pockets helped achieve that ideal inflated look for pants, just as today cargo pants have a broader silhouette than many other cuts of trousers. Also, almost as soon as pockets were routinely included in male costumes, however, people began to worry about what might be concealed within them. By the early 16th century, there was concern that people might be sporting small-scale handguns known as pocket dags, which had only recently been made possible by the innovation of the wheel lock mechanism within firearms. As fashions evolved, men's clothing continued to have more pockets than women's clothing. The middle of the 17th century saw the introduction of the 3-piece suit, which has remained the standard in menswear to the present day. From the beginning, these suits sported a myriad of inset pockets of varying sizes and purposes. Whereas at one time, men had to pay to have pockets added or repaired, by 1700 there was an expectation that men's clothing would have pockets, and that expectation remains true to this day. I will note at this junction, though, that there was an exception to this rule about men having pockets. The least fortunate men in society, that is to say, the enslaved and formerly enslaved, did not have pockets, and many came to view the integration of pockets into clothing as a symbol of freedom. There are even a few accounts of enslaved men adding pockets to their clothing in order to deflect suspicion from them when they escaped from their owners. Pockets became so omnipresent among men's clothing that there was a drive to miniaturize instruments so that men might have things like pocket watches, pocket compasses, pocket knives, and even pocket books, which were not bags at this juncture, but rather books small enough to fit comfortably in the pocket. The addition of the word pocket is still shorthand for anything that has been miniaturized to fit into small spaces, even if they no longer literally fit in a pocket, so pocket games are small games. As men's clothing underwent this radical transformation to the suit, women's styles remained more consistent and continued to feature bodices and full skirts. Most commonly, women continued to carry purses, but there were some tie-on pockets that women could wear, and it was even possible to tie them on under one's skirts. These tie-on pockets could be large and they could be highly decorated, but they did not have the easy access to them in public because you'd have to pull up your skirt to get into your pocket. Though to be fair, men were also discouraged from accessing their pockets in public well into the 18th century because it was seen as unseemly. This pocket space was private space that should be accessed in private. Moreover, ladies' pockets were not sewn in, so that there was a much higher risk of the knot holding them in place, slipping, or coming undone entirely, so the pockets could fall out and be lost, and we actually have advertisements of women looking for their lost pockets. I'm including a link in this show note to show you what the tie-on pocket looked like, and you can also Google just tie-on pockets to see what I mean and how they would have been attached. Moralists poked fun at women's tie-on pockets, but when women did try to don clothing with sewn-in pockets, they expressed alarm. Women's riding habits, for example, frequently included overcoats with pockets sewn into them, and women who wore them were dismissed as unfeminine or as Amazons. In short, until the 18th century, women did have pockets, but their pockets were less useful than the ones men have. As art historian Hannah Carlson has noted, it's not that women weren't pocketed, but rather that they were differently pocketed. Around the turn of the 19th century, as men's clothing began to be mass-produced more frequently, the narrative surrounding pockets shifted. The satirist William Livingston Alden described pockets as a biological given for men, just as facial hair was natural to men. But since pockets allowed independence, they were not appropriate for women or for children, and one mark of adulthood was when a man got clothing with a pocket. Unsurprisingly, the availability of pockets for women depended a lot on which fashions happened to be in at any given moment. When form-fitting dresses became popular at the beginning of the 19th century, tie-in pockets, which were naturally fairly bulky, fell out of fashion and were replaced by reticules, which were effectively purses worn on the wrist. Women who retained their tie-in pockets were seen as old-fashioned, and those who opted for the reticule were often denigrated as silly or frivolous. In other words, whatever choice they made, women were subject to mockery. The narrow silhouette did not last, and by the 1820s, women began wearing wider skirts with tie-on pockets again. There were even a few women who experimented with adding inseam pockets, but when fashion shifted again to favor flat-fronted dresses with large bustles at the back, women's pockets moved into the bustle of the dress, which was obviously not an easy place to access. So while women could still carry stuff with them, unlike men, they could not pull out a pocket from their watch and check the time, which I guess would have been fine since they were not supposed to be carrying practical things like compasses and watches. They were supposed to be carrying domestic things like their sewing. By the turn of the 20th century, pockets had become a political issue. Male writers largely blamed women for the lack of women's pockets, and used the fact that they had not demanded pockets as one more reason to dismiss women as silly and frivolous. It wasn't always that easy to get a pocket, though. While men's clothing was being mass-produced long before, women were still reliant on dressmakers to make their clothing into the 20th century. As such, you would think it would be easy for women to get what they wanted, but that wasn't always the case, as Elizabeth Cady Stanton discovered to her chagrin in 1895 when she asked her dressmakers to add pockets to her dresses. The dressmaker objected, saying that pockets would bulge you out just awful. Still, Stanton persisted and left, thinking that she had won the argument and that she would get a dress with pockets. When she came back to collect her dress, however, she discovered that not one single pocket had been added. In short, even when women were having their clothing individually tailored, they didn't always have control. Arguably, we have even less control now that most of us are buying ready-made clothes. If the store doesn't carry clothing with sufficient pockets, our only recourse is to learn how to sew or to shop in the men's department, and neither of those options appeal to most women. Unlike men's clothing, where pockets are an assumed staple, pocket fashion fades in and out for women's wear. Sometimes women are discouraged from having pockets lest it mess with the fine lines and body-hugging silhouettes. Other times, women are given pockets that are purely decorative or oddly placed. None of these things is the norm with men's clothing. This issue is not just one of fashion, it is a feminist issue, and it has been for a long time. And that's where I'll leave you today. I hope that you've enjoyed learning just a little bit about pockets, and I hope that you'll come back to join us again for another episode of Footnoting History. In the meantime, remember, the best stories are always in the footnotes.